Hello, I'm Michael Hryschenko, and I'm the author and narrator of the Democracy Undecided channel, which explore democracies through simplicities, what democracies really means, and why they never settled. Today we are going to review the framework that I have developed as the analytical foundation for the Democracy Undecided project, which aims to help audiences understand what democracies looks like in practice, what conditions sustain it, and how it changes over time. Rather than ranking countries or promoting political outcomes, the framework is designed to help readers and viewers analyze their own systems, to recognize equilibrium, detect drift, and understand why certain patterns repeat across very different societies. This framework emerged from repeated attempts to explain democracy without reducing it to slogans, moral claims, or ideological positions. Public debates about democracy often collapse into polarized narratives: success or failure, virtue or corruption, stability or collapse. These debates generate conviction but rarely understanding. What is usually missing is a simple structural way to see how democratic systems actually function under pressure. The Hryschenko's democracy equilibrium framework is not an academic model in the formal sense, nor does it seek theoretical completeness. Its purpose is analytical clarity. The goal is to provide a small number of structural concepts that allow a non-specialist to reason about democratic systems without requiring disciplinary training in political science, economics, or law. This work does not defend any country, ideology, or political system. It offers a way to think about democracy that is simple enough to be widely used, but precise enough to reveal why democracies stabilize, drift, or fail. This framework is a conceptual model developed for clarity and public understanding, not a literature review or empirical academic paper. In this part number 4, we will have a look at the short-term judicial and long-term legislative filters that exist in our democracy equilibrium framework. So now we came to this point where we have to introduce two more parts that needs to be added to our macro-political dynamics framework. This slide explains how democracies absorb pressure and why some survive shocks while others drift into imbalance. The judicial system functions as a fast-acting stabilizer. Its role is to block unconstitutional actions immediately, enforce rights and procedures in real time, prevent temporary political majorities from violating core constraints. Courts are designed to react quickly, but narrowly. The filter: immediate access, not long-term structural shifts. When judicial independence weakens, emergency measures normalize, selective enforcement increases, and power shifts faster than institutions can respond. At the same time, the long-term legislative system functions as a slow but deep stabilizer. Its role is to absorb public pressure over time, translate public demands into durable law, prevent impulsive or emotional decision-making, create friction against rapid systematic change. Legislature work through deliberation, committees, multiple veto points, repetition across election cycles. When legislative capacity erodes, policy is bypassed through executive actions, rule change faster than consensus can form, and structural imbalance becomes permanent. So what is in reality combined effect of both of these filters or their inefficiency? Democratic stability depends on both filters working together. Courts prevent sudden violations, legislatures prevent cumulative distortion and gradual capture. Judicial review stops spikes, legislative process prevents drift. If one weakens, the other is overloaded. If both weaken, the democracy equilibrium point begins to shift irreversibly. At the end, we can say that democracy is not protected by strengths. It is protected by friction to diffusion. In democratic systems, long-term legislative change is often understood as a bottom-up process. Citizens express demands, political actors translate those demands into law, and institutions formalize them through deliberation. However, this process relies not on direct access to social reality, but on mediated perceptions. Citizens do not experience complex phenomena such as public health risks, crime trends, economic structures, or demographic change directly at a scale. Instead, their understanding is shaped through information systems, narratives, and social interpretation. Information integrity functions as a critical stabilizer in this process, aligning public perceptions with underlying empirical conditions. When information integrity weakens, perception can detach from reality, and democratic demand becomes vulnerable to narrative capture. In such conditions, the long-term legislative filter does not stop working. It begins filtering the wrong signal. Legislative agendas may then be redirected towards symbolic, exaggerated, or miscalibrated responses that remain formally democratic but lose corrective capacity over time. This does not represent authoritarian override of democracy. Citizen participation, elections, and legislative procedures may continue to function as designed. The failure mode is subtler. Democratic input persists, but its informational foundation erodes. As a result, long-term lawmaking increasingly responds to distorted perceptions rather than real conditions, weakening the legislative filter and accelerating the gradual drift away from democracy equilibrium point. Health crises are perfect stress tests for information integrity because they combine complexity, uncertainty, fear, and urgency. Most citizens cannot independently verify epidemiological data, risks, trade-offs, or policy effectiveness. As a result, public perception becomes highly dependent on mediated information. When information integrity is weak, risks are unevenly framed. Some threats are amplified far beyond empirical evidence, while others are minimized or dismissed. Public debate shifts from analytical disagreement to moralized conflict. Trust fragments, not necessarily because institutions fail formally, but because narratives outspace shared understanding. Importantly, this dynamic can operate in multiple directions. For or against vaccines, for or against restrictions, or for or against institutional authority itself. The key issue is not which policy position was correct, but how urgency and narrative pressure redirected democratic decision-making. Legislative and executive actions increasingly respond to perceived crisis, intensity rather than stable institutional trust. This illustrates how democratic lawmaking can remain procedurally valid while becoming informationally misaligned. Perceived crime waves offer another example of how democratic systems can drift under the narrative pressure. Media amplification of isolated or atypical incidents can create the impression of systematic breakdown, even when long-term data does not support that conclusion. As public fear rises, political pressure intensifies. Legislators and executives respond rapidly, often expanding policing powers, increasing penalties, or accelerating legal change. These actions are typically democratically informed and justified as responsive governance. However, later analysis frequently shows that the underlying problem was smaller, localized, or structurally different from how it was perceived at the time. The process was democratic, but perception outran reality. The long-term legislative filter weakened not because citizens participated too much, but because participation was guided by amplified narratives rather than calibrated evidence. This reinforces the distinction between democratic procedures and democratic correction. Algorithmic systems intensify this problem structurally. Platforms reward engagement, not accuracy. Content that triggers outrage, certainty, or emotional response is amplified, while nuisance, uncertainty, and complexity are suppressed. This reshapes the informational environment in which democratic choice occurs. Fringe narratives gain disproportionate visibility, moderation appears weak or biased, and complex trade-offs disappear from public discourse. Citizens still choose, but the menu of choices is curated by engagement incentives rather than informational quality. As a result, democratic demand becomes skewed. Legislative agenda respond to distorted pressure signals, not because institutions are captured, but because the informational input feeding the long-term filter has been degraded. This accelerates drift without eliminating elections, debate, or formal participation. Algorithmic amplification thus represents a systematic threat not to democracy's form, but to its informational foundations. Let's now move on to short-term judicial filters, and especially aspects relevant to enforcement capture and procedural degradation. So, in democratic systems, the short-term judicial filter functions as the immediate break-in system that prevents rapid power accumulation. Courts, prosecutors, and law enforcement institutions translate abstract rights into real constraints by enforcing due process, equal application of law, and compliance with judicial rulings. However, this filter depends not only on formal independence, but on operational integrity. The capacity and the willingness to apply law predictably and universally, including against powerful actors. When judicial integrity weakens, democratic stability can degrade without any formal suspension of elections or constitutional rules. Enforcement becomes selective, legal procedures become instruments rather than constraints, and accountability shifts from rule-based to discretionary. In such conditions, power can expand rapidly through legalistic means: emergency orders, prosecutions, licensing, regulatory penalties, or procedural delays, while remaining outwardly lawful. This does not require overt dictatorship. It represents a subtler failure mode in which institutions remain formally intact but stop performing their stabilizing function, allowing short-term shocks to convert into irreversible political advantage and accelerating drift away from the democracy equilibrium point. The short-term judicial filter plays a decisive role during crises, when executive power expands most rapidly and democratic stability depends on immediate institutional resistance. Emergency powers are not inherently anti-democratic. They are often necessary to respond to security threats, public health emergencies, or systemic shocks. However, their democratic function depends on judicial enforcement that is timely, independent, and binding. When courts actively review emergency measures, enforce sunset clauses, and require proportionality, temporary power expansion remains reversible. When judicial review weakens through delay, deference, selective enforcement, or non-compliance with rulings, emergency powers can normalize without formal suspension of constitutional order. Law continues to exist, but its constraining function erodes. Executive actions become procedurally legal, yet substantively unchecked. In this condition, crisis-driven authority accumulates faster than democratic correction mechanism can respond, allowing short-term shocks to translate into durable political advantage. The result is not immediate dictatorship, but accelerated drift away from the democracy equilibrium point, as legality becomes a vehicle for concentration rather than a barrier against it. Emergency powers test the judicial filter. When courts enforce proportionality, review, and reversibility, crises remain temporary. When review becomes symbolic or delayed, exceptional authority hardens into permanent advantage, enabling democratic drift without formal rupture. Democratic instability emerges not from the presence of force, but from the erosion of filtering capacity. When judicial independence weakens, emergency measures normalize. When legislative capacity erodes, executive action replaces deliberation. When both filters degrade simultaneously, pressure that was once absorbed begins to shift the democracy equilibrium point itself, accelerating drift towards authoritarian, oligarchic, or anarchic outcomes even while formal democratic structures remain intact. The democracy equilibrium point exists when no single force, state, business, or citizens, can dominate the system, fragment it, or escape constraints. Power remains contestable, reversible, and bounded. DEP is not harmony. It is a constant tension held within institutional limits. Democracy does not survive by eliminating conflict. Conflict is natural. Democracy survives by preventing any force from winning permanently. Think of democracy equilibrium point not as a point on a line, but as the center of the triangle. Too much state dominance produces authoritarian drift, too much business dominance produces oligarchic drift, too much citizen fragmentation produces anarchic drift. DEP exists only when all three forces are constrained simultaneously. What equilibrium looks like in practice? A democracy is near DEP when state power is constrained, meaning anti-authoritarian, courts can block executive action, legislatures can remove or override leaders, emergency power exists but are temporary, reviewable, and reversible. Economic power is dispersed, markets are competitive, and failure is possible. Labor has real bargaining power. Political access cannot simply be bought. Authority is legitimate and enforced. Laws are broadly obeyed because they are seen as fair. Enforcement is equal, predictable, and applies to powerful actors too. Conflicts are resolved institutionally, not through violence. DEP is not a stability through stillness. It is stability through continuous correction enabled by a fast judicial filter, which is reactive, narrow, and immediate, a slow legislative filter, which is deliberative, broad, and cumulative, information integrity, which keeps long-term public demand reality-based rather than narrative-driven. When any of these fail, pressure is no longer absorbed. It moves the equilibrium itself. What are early warning signs of drift? Power becomes irreversible, enforcement becomes selective, outcomes become structurally predictable, public demand detaches from underlying conditions. So, in conclusion, democracy survives not by eliminating conflict, but by preventing any force from winning permanently. So, in the next part of the model, part number 5, we must consider external forces that act on any democracy and add them to our model for completeness of the model entirely. See you in the next one.